Concrete dust and diesel fumes usually masked the stench of corruption at Sterling Point. Victor Rinaldi owned the steel, the unions, and the streets beneath them. He came to inspect a multi-million-dollar laundering operation, but a $10 styrofoam container of baked ziti derailed his entire criminal empire. The wind whipping off Boston Harbor carried the bitter chill of late November, biting through the heavy canvas jackets of the ironworkers at the Sterling Point development. It was a massive $2 billion commercial high-rise project, managed on paper by Apex Holdings, LLC. In reality, it was the crown jewel of the Rinaldi crime syndicate's money laundering portfolio. Victor Rinaldi stepped out of his black Lincoln Navigator, his tailored Italian overcoat, a stark contrast to the mud and gravel of the construction site. At 38, Victor was the undisputed head of the family, having taken the reins after a bloody internal war 5 years prior. He was a man composed of sharp angles and colder calculations, his eyes the color of flint. He wasn't here for a photo opportunity with the mayor. He was here to ensure Arthur Pendleton, the notoriously greedy union boss of Local 44, wasn't skimming off the top of the concrete contracts. Flanked by his heavily built underboss, Vincent Caruso, Victor walked the perimeter of the site. His mind was consumed by percentages, offshore accounts, and the ever-present threat of federal indictments. Pendleton says the delays are weather-related, Vincent grunted, adjusting the collar of his coat against the wind. Pendleton is a liar, Victor replied, his voice barely above a murmur, yet carrying an edge that made the nearby foreman physically flinch. He's stalling to bleed the payroll. Tell him if the foundation isn't poured by Friday, he'll be part of it. As they rounded the corner of the site near Seaport Boulevard, a scent cut through the acrid smell of curing cement and exhaust. It was rich, savory, and entirely out of place, the smell of slow-braised beef, garlic, and simmering tomatoes. Victor stopped. Across the muddy access road sat a beat-up 1998 Chevy step van. Its white paint was chipping, revealing rust along the wheel wells, and a hand-painted wooden sign hung from the ordering window, Alice's Kitchen. A line of 20 burly construction workers stood shivering in the cold, waiting patiently. "What is that?" Victor asked, frowning. Unsanctioned vendors were usually chased off his sites by union heavies. "Just a lunch truck, boss," Vincent said, dismissing it. "Belongs to some widow. The guys like her food. Keeps them on site instead of wandering off to the pubs on Dorchester Avenue." Victor didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the woman working inside the cramped, steaming metallic box. Alice Hayes was 32, though the exhaustion etched around her green eyes made her look older. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian bun, escaping in damp tendrils around her face due to the heat of the flat-top grill. She moved with a practiced, frantic rhythm, flipping burgers, ladling heavy scoops of baked ziti into styrofoam containers, and handing back change with a warm, genuine smile that seemed to momentarily thaw the freezing workers. Sitting on an overturned milk crate near the back doors of the van was a small boy, no older than 5, wrapped in an oversized winter coat, diligently coloring in a notebook. Something entirely foreign shifted inside Victor's chest. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was an acute fascination with her resilience. In a world where everyone deferred to him out of terror, this woman was fighting her own war in a tiny, grease-stained trench, completely oblivious to the predators circling her city. "Get me a plate," Victor ordered. Vincent blinked, clearly taken aback. "Boss, we have reservations at the Capitol Grill in 20 minutes with the alderman." "Cancel them." I said, "Get me a plate." "Actually, no. I'll get it myself." Victor strode across the gravel, the line of workers miraculously parting for him. They recognized him not as a mob boss, but as the billionaire owner of Apex Holdings, the man who signed their checks. They stepped back, lowering their eyes. Alice, however, didn't know Victor Rinaldi from any other suit. When he reached the window, she was wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice slightly hoarse, but remarkably sweet. She didn't cower. She didn't look away. She just looked at him with polite, weary expectation. "Whatever the house specialty is," Victor said, his sharp eyes taking in the smudges of flour on her apron. "That would be the braised short rib sandwich, with provolone and au jus. $10, she said, already moving to assemble the meal. She worked quickly, wrapping the massive sandwich in foil and handing it through the window, along with a stack of cheap paper napkins. Victor reached into his money clip, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and laid it on the metal counter. "Keep it." Alice looked at the bill, then up at him, her expression hardening just a fraction. She didn't touch the money. "I run a food truck, mister, not a charity case. And I don't have change for 100. Do you have a 10? Behind Victor, Vincent bristled, stepping forward. "Hey, you don't talk to—" Victor held up a single gloved hand, silencing his underboss instantly. He looked back at Alice, genuinely amused. It had been a decade since someone had flatly refused him. "My apologies," Victor said smoothly. He rummaged in his pocket, found a $10 bill, and swapped it for the 100. "I didn't mean to offend you." "No offense taken," Alice said, dropping the bill into her cash box. "Enjoy the sandwich." Victor walked back to his SUV, unwrapping the foil. He took a bite. The meat was impossibly tender, perfectly seasoned, and richer than anything he'd eaten at the 5-star restaurants he frequented. He looked back through the tinted window of the Navigator, watching Alice hand a container of food to her little boy. "Vincent," Victor said, his eyes never leaving the food truck, "make sure the union thugs leave her alone. She stays as long as she wants." Over the next 3 weeks, Victor Rinaldi's schedule underwent a bizarre transformation. The ruthless syndicate boss, who usually spent his afternoons brokering illicit deals and managing a network of illegal gambling rings, suddenly found himself parked at the Sterling Point construction site every day at 12:30 p.m. He never brought his entourage anymore, just his driver. He would walk up to the window, order the daily special, and lean against the side of his black SUV to eat. Slowly, a tentative, unlikely rapport built between the billionaire developer Vic and the struggling single mother. Alice found him enigmatic, but oddly comforting. He was intimidating. Certainly there was a quiet danger in the way he stood and the way he observed the world, but he was unfailingly polite to her and unusually gentle when speaking to her son, Leo. One freezing Tuesday afternoon, business was slow due to a sleet storm. Victor stood under the small awning of Alice's truck, sipping a bitter coffee she had brewed. "You shouldn't have him out here in this weather," Victor said softly, gesturing to Leo, who was huddled by the truck's small space heater. Alice sighed, her shoulders slumping as she wiped down the counter. "I don't have a choice, Vic. After-school care is a luxury I can't swing right now. It's just me and him." "His father?" Victor asked, stepping carefully onto personal territory. Alice's jaw tightened. "Brian died 2 years ago. Car accident on the Massachusetts Turnpike. It was ice and alcohol." She paused, her hands gripping the cleaning rag. "He left us with a lot of things. A life insurance policy wasn't one of them. But he did leave debts. A lot of debts." Victor's eyes darkened, though his voice remained perfectly level. "What kind of debts?" "The kind you don't file bankruptcy on," Alice muttered, shaking her head as if to clear the dark thoughts. She looked up and forced a smile. "But we're surviving. One short rib sandwich at a time." Victor didn't smile back. The protective instinct that flared violently inside him was entirely foreign. He wanted to wipe out whatever financial burden was crushing her. He wanted to hand her the keys to a brownstone in Beacon Hill and tell her she never had to smell diesel exhaust again, but he knew she wouldn't accept it. Alice was proud, fiercely independent, and completely ignorant of the dark, violent world he controlled. The collision of their two worlds happened 3 days later. Victor had been delayed at a sit-down with the Russian syndicate across town. He arrived at the Sterling Point site just after 2 p.m. The lunch rush was over, and the access road was largely empty. As his SUV turned onto the muddy path, Victor saw something that made his blood run cold. A silver Cadillac Escalade was parked diagonally, blocking Alice's food truck. Standing aggressively outside the serving window was Tommy Rizzuto. Tommy was a mid-level enforcer and loan shark who operated under Vincent Caruso's crew. He was a notoriously cruel man, known for breaking fingers before asking questions. Victor tapped the glass partition, signaling his driver to stop the SUV about 50 yards away. He sat in the shadows of the tinted windows, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. Through the pouring rain, He watched as Tommy slammed his fist onto the metal counter of Alice's truck, making the entire vehicle shake. "I don't care about the weather, Alice." Tommy's voice carried over the wind, thick with menace. "Brian borrowed 50 grand. With the VIG, you owe 75. We gave you 2 years because of the kid, but the boss's patience is gone." Inside the truck, Alice was pale, her arm instinctively wrapped around Leo, who was hiding behind her legs. "I told you, Tommy. I have $2,000 today. I'll have another 1,000 on Friday. I'm paying it down." "2 grand is an insult," Tommy spat. He reached through the window, grabbing a heavy metal spatula and tossing it onto the muddy ground. "Next Friday, Alice, you have 10 grand for me, or I take the truck. And if I take the truck, I still need the rest of the money. And I know you don't want me looking at other ways you can earn it." Victor watched, paralyzed by a sickening realization. The boss's patience is gone. Tommy wasn't operating a rogue book. The money Brian Hayes had borrowed the crushing debt that kept Alice shivering in a food truck 14 hours a day. The terror that currently had her trembling in fear belonged to the Rinaldi family. It belonged to him. Victor was the unseen monster haunting Alice's life. Tommy spat on the ground, turned his collar up, and got back into his silver Escalade, peeling out and leaving deep ruts in the mud. For a long moment, Victor sat in the back of his Lincoln, the silence inside the cabin deafening. He looked at his hands that had built an empire on fear and extortion. He had thought of himself as a businessman, a necessary evil in a corrupt city. But looking at Alice, who had collapsed onto her knees inside the truck to hug her terrified son, the illusion shattered. He was the villain in her story. "Boss?" his driver asked tentatively, watching Victor in the rearview mirror. "Do you want me to pull up to the truck?" Victor's jaw locked. If he went to her now, if he made Tommy disappear, she would inevitably find out who he was. The gentle, wealthy developer named Vic would die, replaced by Victor Rinaldi, the mob boss who owned her late husband's life. "No," Victor said, his voice a lethal, vibrating rasp. "Turn the car around. We're going to Vincent's social club in the North End. Right now." The storm was just beginning. The air inside the Calabria Social Club was thick with the scent of dark roast espresso, imported cigars, and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Located behind a frosted glass storefront in Boston's North End, it was the nerve center for Vincent Caruso's street operations. Victor Rinaldi walked through the double doors, the heavy oak slamming shut behind him, cutting off the bustling noise of Hanover Street. The ambient chatter of a dozen made men playing cards and nursing sambuca died instantly. Cards froze in midair. Chairs scraped against the linoleum as men hastily stood out of respect and sudden, paralyzing fear. Victor rarely came to the club. His presence here meant the corporate veneer had been stripped away, and the boss of the family was out for blood. "Where's Tommy?" Victor asked. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion, a flat, terrifying baritone that commanded absolute obedience. Vincent, who had been sitting in a leather booth going over sports betting ledgers, stood up slowly, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He signaled to one of the younger associates. In the back, "Boss," counting the afternoon collections. Victor didn't wait. He stalked past the bar, his tailored overcoat sweeping behind him, and kicked open the door to the back office. Tommy Rizzuto was sitting at a metal desk, stacks of 20s and 50s piled haphazardly around a brass counting machine. He jumped at the noise, his hand instinctively dropping toward the Smith and Wesson holstered at his hip, before he realized who was standing in the doorway. He immediately raised his hands, a nervous, ingratiating smile breaking across his heavily scarred face. "Don Rinaldi," Tommy stammered, quickly standing up. "I didn't know you were coming down to the neighborhood. I would have—" "The ledger, Tommy," Victor interrupted, stepping into the cramped, windowless room. Vincent filled the doorway behind him, blocking any chance of exit. The ledger?" Tommy blinked, his eyes darting between Victor and Vincent. "Which one, boss? The sports book or the street loans?" "The street loans." "Open it to the letter H." Tommy's hands shook slightly as he unlocked the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a worn black leather-bound book. He flipped hastily through the pages, H. Okay, I got it. Higgins, Howell, Hayes. Stop on Hayes, Victor commanded. He stepped closer, the sheer physical presence of the man suffocating the room. Brian Hayes, deceased. Tell me about the account. Tommy swallowed hard, sweat suddenly beading on his forehead, despite the drafty room. Right. Brian Hayes. Dumb contractor, liked the ponies. Borrowed 50 large from us 3 years ago. Wrapped his car around a bridge abutment. He left a widow, Alice. We've been letting the VIG run, collecting a few grand here and there. She runs a food truck down at the Apex site. I just went to see her today, actually. Put the squeeze on her. Told her I'd take the truck if she didn't have 10 grand by Friday. Tommy puffed his chest out slightly, mistaking Victor's inquiry for an audit of his efficiency. Don't worry, boss. She's terrified. We'll get our money, or we'll put her on the street. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the concrete foundation. Victor stared at Tommy, his expression an unreadable mask of ice. You threatened a mother and a 5-year-old child in front of my construction site. It's just business, boss, Tommy said, his smile faltering as the temperature in the room plummeted. She owes the family. Vincent said we squeeze the delinquents before the end of the quarter. I am the family, Victor whispered. Before Tommy could take another breath, Victor's hand shot out, grabbing Tommy by the throat and slamming him backward against the cinderblock wall. The heavy metal desk screeched across the floor as Tommy kicked wildly, gasping for air. Victor's grip was like an industrial vice, his eyes burning with a dark, violent fury that hadn't been seen since the Syndicate Wars. Listen to me very carefully, Tommy, Victor hissed. Leaning in so close, Tommy could smell the peppermint on his breath. Brian Hayes' debt is 0. It never existed. If you ever go near that food truck again, if you ever look at Alice Hayes, if you so much as breathe the air on the same city block as her or her son, I won't just kill you. I will dismantle you. Victor let go, and Tommy collapsed to the floor, violently coughing and clutching his throat, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Victor picked up the black ledger, calmly ripped the page containing Brian Hayes' name out of the binding, and struck a silver Zippo lighter. He held the paper until the flames licked his leather gloves, then dropped the burning ashes onto Tommy's desk. He turned to leave, but Vincent blocked the doorway, his massive arms crossed. With all due respect, boss, Vincent rumbled, keeping his voice low so the men outside couldn't hear. What are you doing? Word gets out we're forgiving 50 grand debts because a widow bats her eyes, and half the city will stop paying. We look weak. Over a broad, slinging hash? Victor stopped, turning his head just enough to catch Vincent's eye. Are you questioning how I run my city, Vincent? Vincent hesitated. He had seen Victor order hits on his own cousins to secure the throne. He knew better than to cross the line. No, boss. Your city. Your rules. Good. Victor adjusted his cuffs, his composure instantly returning. Send Harrison to Alice tomorrow morning. Have him draft a notarized letter from a fictitious collection agency stating the debt was a clerical error and has been discharged in full. And Vincent? Yeah, boss. Put 2 of our best unseen men on that truck, day and night. If anyone so much as gives her the wrong change, I want to know about it. Victor walked out of the club, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He had just compromised the ruthless reputation he had spent a decade building. And the terrifying truth was, he didn't care. The sky over Boston was an uncompromising, bruised purple, threatening freezing rain as Alice wiped down the stainless steel counters of the truck. It was Thursday afternoon, and for the first time in 2 years, Alice felt like she could breathe. In her apron pocket was a crisp, official-looking letter from Pinnacle Financial Recovery. It stated, in dense legalese, that Brian's debt had been illegally inflated by a rogue agent who was now under federal investigation, and, as a result, the entire balance had been expunged. It was a miracle, a bizarre, inexplicable miracle that had caused her to break down sobbing in her kitchen that morning. Hey, you're smiling. Alice looked up to see Vic leaning against the window frame. He looked different today, no tailored overcoat, just a dark wool sweater and a leather jacket. He looked surprisingly normal and devastatingly handsome. I have reason to, Alice beamed, handing him his usual black coffee. A massive weight just got lifted off my shoulders, Vic. I don't want to jinx it by talking about the details, but for the first time since Brian died, I think Leo and I are going to be okay. Victor took the coffee, feeling a sharp pang of guilt mixed with a profound sense of relief. Seeing the light return to her green eyes was intoxicating. I'm glad to hear that, Alice. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. Apex Holdings owns a vacant commercial property in the Back Bay. It used to be a bakery, fully equipped kitchen, seating for 40. I need a tenant to keep the building occupied for tax purposes. The rent would be practically nothing. Alice stared at him, stunned. Vic, I can't accept that. I don't do charity. It's not charity, Victor lied smoothly, leaning closer. It's a business arrangement. You bring foot traffic to my block, the property value stabilizes, and you get out of the freezing cold. Leo gets a back room to do his homework instead of sitting on a milk crate. Alice looked back at Leo, who was currently drawing on a napkin. The temptation to give her son a warm, safe place was overwhelming. She looked back at Vic, her eyes softening. Why are you so good to us, Vic? You don't even know me. Victor looked at her, the truth burning the back of his throat. Because I am the monster in the dark, and you are the only light I've seen in 10 years. Because you deserve a break, he said softly. He reached through the window, his large, warm hand gently covering hers. Alice didn't pull away. A quiet electricity passed between them, a fragile connection built on a massive, structural lie. Then, the tires screeched. It happened with the sudden, chaotic violence that only belongs to the criminal underworld. A dark blue Dodge Charger tore around the corner of the construction site, fishtailing in the mud before slamming to a halt 30 feet from the food truck. Before the car even stopped in park, the back doors flew open. 2 men wearing ski masks stepped out, raising matte black automatic weapons. Victor's instincts, honed by years of street warfare, took over before his conscious mind could process the threat. Tommy Rizzuto's loyalists? The Bratva? It didn't matter. Get down! Victor roared. He didn't dive for cover. Instead, Victor vaulted straight through the serving window of the food truck, shattering the plexiglass display case and tackling Alice to the metal floor just as the first barrage of bullets tore through the side of the vehicle. Deafening gunfire echoed across the construction site. Sparks flew as heavy rounds shredded the metal exterior of the truck, shattering jars of sauce and exploding the coffee urn. Boiling water and broken glass rained down on them. Alice screamed, covering her head, her mind entirely unable to process the nightmare unfolding around her. "Leo!" Alice shrieked, struggling blindly to crawl toward the back of the truck where her son was crying in terror. "Stay down," Victor barked, his voice no longer that of the gentle developer. It was a vicious, feral command. He pinned Alice to the floor with one arm, shielding her body with his own. With his free hand, Victor reached into the small of his back, beneath the leather jacket. He drew a custom, suppressed, Sig Sauer P-226. The shooting paused as the men outside advanced, clearly aiming to finish the job, assuming Victor was trapped inside the metal box. Victor didn't wait for them to find an angle. He kicked open the side access door of the truck and rolled out onto the muddy ground into the pouring rain. Alice, trembling uncontrollably, pulled Leo against her chest, pressing herself against the greasy floorboards, and watched through the open doorway. What she saw shattered her world entirely. Vic, sweet, generous billionaire Vic, moved with terrifying, lethal precision. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't calling for help. He rose to one knee in the mud, both hands on the grip of his pistol. Twip, twip. The suppressed weapon coughed twice. The first masked gunman dropped instantly, a fatal hole appearing in the center of his forehead. The second gunman panicked, spraying wildly toward Victor, bullets chewing up the mud inches from Victor's boots. Victor didn't even flinch. He stepped forward into the line of fire, his posture perfect, his expression stone cold. Twip, twip. The second man collapsed against the side of the Dodge Charger, sliding down, leaving a streak of crimson against the blue paint. The driver of the Charger, realizing the ambush had completely failed, slammed the car into reverse. Before he could turn the wheel, 2 black SUVs materialized from the access roads, completely boxing the Charger in. 4 massive men in dark suits, Victor's unseen security detail poured out, dragging the screaming driver from the car and pinning him to the gravel with a boot to his neck. The chaotic thunder of gunfire was replaced by the heavy drum of rain and the harsh, ragged breathing of the men outside. Victor stood in the center of the carnage, his weapon still drawn, and held at the low ready. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead. He looked at the bodies, then at the driver, giving a brief, sharp nod to his men. Slowly, Victor turned back to the food truck. He holstered the weapon, his chest heaving, his eyes frantically searching the shattered interior for Alice. "Alice," Victor breathed, stepping up to the open door, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Alice, are you hurt? Is Leo?" Alice was backed into the farthest corner of the truck, clutching her crying son so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at the blood on Victor's hands, the gun at his hip, and the cold, dead bodies laying in the mud behind him. Her eyes, which had looked at him with such warmth just 3 minutes ago, were now dilated with absolute, unadulterated horror. "Stay away from us," Alice whispered, her voice shaking violently. "Alice, please, let me explain," Victor pleaded, stepping onto the threshold of the truck. "I said stay away," she screamed, grabbing a heavy kitchen knife from the counter and pointing it at him with a trembling hand. You killed them. You executed them. Who are you? What are you?" Victor stopped, the pain in his chest sharper than any bullet he had ever taken. The illusion was gone. The gentle developer was dead, bleeding out in the mud alongside the assassins. "My name is Victor Rinaldi," he said quietly, the heavy truth falling like a shroud over them both. "And I'm the man who owns this city." Alice dropped the knife, the name hitting her like a physical blow. Everyone in Boston knew the name Rinaldi. They were the boogeymen. They were the monsters who had owned her husband, the monsters she had been running from for 2 years. "Oh my God," Alice gasped, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. "It was you. The debt. The letter. It was all you." "I did it to protect you," Victor said, his voice raw. "You lied to me," she sobbed, holding Leo closer as the sirens began to wail in the distance. "You're not a savior, Vic. You're the devil." Victor stood in the rain, watching the only beautiful thing in his dark world recoil from him in terror. For the first time in his life, the Don of the Rinaldi family had absolutely no idea how to fix what he had broken. The wail of police sirens cut through the freezing rain, snapping the hypnotic terror that gripped the construction site. Victor looked at Alice, his heart fracturing against his ribs. He couldn't be caught standing over 2 dead cartel hitters with an unregistered firearm. If he went down, his entire syndicate would collapse into a bloody civil war, and Alice would be dragged into federal court as a star witness. She would never be safe again. "Harding," Victor snapped, turning to the imposing man who led his security detail. "You are a licensed private contractor. You neutralized an armed robbery. I was never here. Do you understand?" Thomas Harding nodded sharply, already pulling his identification and permits from his breast pocket. "Understood, boss. Go." Victor turned back to the shattered food truck. Alice was still cowering in the corner, holding Leo, her eyes wide with a revulsion that cut Victor deeper than any blade. He wanted to apologize, to promise her a beautiful life, but he knew the words would just be poison coming from him. "I'm sorry," Victor whispered, the fierce Mafia Don suddenly sounding like a broken man. He turned and vanished into the pouring rain, slipping into the shadows of the muddy access road, just as the first black and white cruisers swarmed the Apex holding site. A suffocating week passed. Alice sat in her drafty 1-bedroom apartment in Somerville, the silence screaming at her. Her food truck, her livelihood, and her independence was a bullet-riddled crime scene, permanently impounded by the Boston Police Department. Detective Miller had questioned her extensively, ultimately accepting Thomas Harding's flawless cover story of a random, tragic hijacking gone wrong. Alice knew the terrifying truth, but a primal, paralyzing fear kept her mouth firmly shut. Every time she heard a floorboard creak in the hallway, she expected Victor Rinaldi's ruthless men to kick down her door to permanently silence the only loose end. Instead, on a gray Thursday morning, a heavy manila envelope arrived via certified mail. Alice opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents. It was the deed to the commercial bakery in Back Bay, fully paid, taxes covered for the next 10 years, placed irrevocably in her name. Beneath the deed was a cashier's check from an offshore trust for $100,000, designated exclusively for Leo's education. At the bottom of the envelope was a single piece of heavy cardstock with a handwritten note. "You were right. I am a monster, and my world will only ever bring you pain. Consider this severance for the truck. You are completely free, and you will never see me again. V." Alice stared at the heavy masculine scrawl, a chaotic storm of relief and profound loss washing over her. He was letting her go. The most dangerous man in Boston was giving her everything she had ever dreamed of and stepping back into the dark. She hated what he represented, hated the violence that clung to him, but she couldn't erase the memory of his massive frame throwing itself over her body, absorbing the space between her and death. But the criminal underworld rarely respects honorable exits. Declan O'Bannon, the vicious head of a rival South Boston syndicate, had secretly authorized the food truck hit. He had noticed Victor Rinaldi's bizarre, unprotected daily routine at the Sterling Point site and deduced the untouchable Don had finally developed a fatal weakness. The failed assassination only confirmed O'Bannon's suspicions. If Victor cared about the woman, she was the ultimate leverage. It was shortly after midnight when the heavy wooden frame of Alice's apartment door splintered inward with a deafening, violent crack. Two massive men in heavy leather jackets pushed into the narrow, dimly lit hallway. Alice screamed, dropping the laundry basket she was holding. She scrambled backward, scooping a sleeping Leo off the living room rug and backing into the tiny kitchen. "Well, look at this." The larger enforcer sneered, pulling a heavy plastic zip tie from his pocket. "Rinaldi's pet. Declan O'Bannon wants a word with you, sweetheart. Put the kid down and walk toward me." Alice grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stovetop, her knuckles white, her entire body shaking. She wouldn't let them take her son. She would die on this cheap linoleum first. Before the enforcer could take another step, the fire escape window in the kitchen shattered completely. Glass exploded across the floor as Victor Rinaldi came through the frame like a dark, vengeful god. He hadn't left her. He had been sitting in a freezing, unmarked sedan across the street every single night, standing a silent, lonely guard over a woman who despised him. Victor didn't use a gun this time. The quarters were too tight, the risk of a ricochet hitting Alice or Leo too high. He moved with terrifying, fluid lethality. He drove a combat knife deep into the first attacker's thigh, twisting the blade brutally before throwing the screaming man against the refrigerator. The second enforcer panicked, drawing a snub-nosed revolver from his waistband and firing a wild, deafening shot in the confined space. The bullet tore through Victor's left shoulder, spraying crimson across Alice's faded floral wallpaper. Victor barely grunted. The pain didn't even register against the absolute fury of seeing men threaten Alice. He stepped directly into the line of fire, grabbed the enforcer's wrist, and snapped it backward with a sickening crunch. As the gun clattered to the floor, Victor drove his knee forcefully into the man's chest, collapsing his ribs. Both attackers lay incapacitated and groaning on the floor in under 10 seconds. Victor stood panting heavily, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, dark blood quickly soaking his black wool sweater. He looked at Alice, his flint-colored eyes wide with a frantic, desperate need to know she was unharmed. "Are you hurt?" Victor gasped, his voice tight and ragged. Alice slowly lowered the heavy skillet. She looked at the blood pooling rapidly around his expensive leather boots, then at the shattered window he had thrown himself through. "You told me I would never see you again," Alice whispered, her voice trembling. "I lied," Victor rasped, leaning heavily against the kitchen counter as his adrenaline faded and his legs threatened to give out. "O'Bannon sent them. I couldn't let them touch you." "I'm sorry, Alice. I'll get my cleaners up here to remove these two immediately. Then I'll disappear. I swear it. You have the bakery. You're safe now." He turned slowly, intending to stumble back out into the freezing night, a king accepting his permanent exile to keep her in the light. "Victor, stop." The use of his real name froze him in his tracks. He turned back. Alice had set a crying Leo gently behind the kitchen island. She grabbed a clean dish towel from the counter and walked directly toward him, her face set with a strange, fierce determination. "You're bleeding all over my floor," she said, her voice shaking, but her hands were entirely steady as she pressed the thick towel hard against his gunshot wound. Victor winced, his breath catching in his throat. He looked down at her, entirely bewildered. "Why are you helping me?" "I'm the devil, Alice. You said it yourself." Alice looked up, her green eyes locking onto his. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable realization. The world was full of monsters, men like Tommy, men like O'Bannon, men who took and destroyed. But Victor was different. "You are," Alice said softly, her thumb gently brushing a streak of blood from his cheek. "But you're the only devil who would bleed for us. You're my devil now." Victor's heart slammed against his ribs. He pulled her against his uninjured side, burying his face in her hair as the sirens began to wail in the distance once again. He knew then that he would burn down every rival syndicate in Boston, level every corrupt union, and wage war against the entire city to keep her safe. The billionaire boss had finally found his queen, and the real empire was just beginning to be built. Victor completely dismantled the O'Bannon syndicate the following week, cementing his absolute rule over Boston's underworld. Alice opened her bakery in Back Bay, fully shielded by the unseen, terrifying power of the Rinaldi family. They married privately, in a quiet ceremony in Florence. Victor never scrubbed the blood from his ledger, but Alice realized that sometimes surviving a dark world requires falling in love with its most dangerous shadow.